latest book, Whites and Democracy in South Africa. Professor of Sociology Roger Southall avoids the negative and condemnatory approach generally seen in writing on white South Africans, the creators and beneficiaries of apartheid. Well, let's talk about the book that he's penned, Whites and Democracy in South Africa. Professor Southall, good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. Let's talk a little bit about this book, an interesting topic of research that you've undertaken. And I say research because it's not just books based on your own ideas, but you've gone out intentionally to do some background work to really substantiate some of the themes you cover.
Yes, I use mixed methods. Obviously, I refer to quite a lot of theory and I refer to the history, which is terribly important. And I do a broad review of various issues and political behavior, for instance. But much of the core of the book is based on the responses given by participants in 8 focus groups which were conducted around the country. Regarding the issue of how whites have adapted to democracy. And the answers they received, or they gave, were really very diverse, and they pointed to the fact that it's virtually impossible to talk about whites as a generality, that whites are not homogeneous, their views are different, and that there is a lot of diversity in their behavior and in their attitudes to contemporary South Africa.
Part of your research entailed focus group interviews that you held in different parts of the country. I'm curious to know, what kind of questions were you asking those that were part of these focus groups?
Yes, well, I looked at the responses in terms of 3 major issues. First of all, how do whites look back on the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Because that really helps us to consider how whites look back on the history of apartheid. And I found actually the answers to the whole issue of the TRC perhaps the most interesting and in some ways the most comforting responses I received. Because overall there was a clear recognition of the moral wrongness of apartheid. And I think that given the issues which the TRC raised, and the general indication at the time the TRC was conducted that whites were not responding positively to it, I think this indicates something of a significant and welcome shift in attitudes. It's much more complicated than I'm indicating here, but lack of time allows stroking out those differences. But I would argue that, generally speaking, the responses to the whole questions about the complicity with apartheid was quite comforting. For instance, on complicity, there was a tendency to deflect blame upon the security forces and upon the politicians rather than taking personal responsibility. Nonetheless, there was wide reflection on the extent to which people as ordinary whites had participated in apartheid and not taken any action against it. So there was a lot of comforting reflection, I think. Otherwise, the respondents tended to record a lot of disillusion with democracy, as it has turned out. Importantly, I think it turned out that there was no overall wish to return to apartheid. There was disillusion with democracy. I think a lot of the disillusion was shared with the sort of disillusion which is displayed by black South Africans and others today. And there was quite a lot of fear of crime and so on. And on the other hand, that this was countered by a much more positive spin, where people said, no, they fully accepted democracy. They had a positive attitude to political participation, and so on. So overall, very mixed answers, but by no means entirely negative, and I think it indicates that whites may have accepted democracy. I term them in many ways reluctant Democrats, but they comply with democracy even if they have not welcomed it with open arms.
Of course, one of the big conversations in a country like South Africa today is beyond just the democracy that we have now. It's about the very real issues that affect the majority of South Africans that relate to the state of the economy and who owns the economy, and the role of policies to try and redress the impact of apartheid on a country like South Africa. What were the responses in that regard, and do we have any more insight about why the issue of redistribution of wealth is such a big challenge for this country?
Well, you're absolutely right. I think continues to be a lot of resentment, if you like, about black empowerment and about equity employment. There was quite a pronounced tendency to regard this as so-called reverse racism. And I think there was still something of a reluctance to engage with the whole necessity for redistribution. But I think you're absolutely right that unless we engage in some form of, when I say redistribution, not necessarily redistributing a present pie, but redistributing a larger pie. And I think that the way to get white buy-in is for the government to adopt policies which would encourage the appropriate form of economic growth. Unless ordinary black people in townships have hope that they will escape poverty and unemployment, they are not going to be particularly interested in whether whites have adapted to democracy or not. And I think it's incumbent upon us as a society to be much more flexible in the way we think about bringing about economic growth. At the moment, we seem to be dividing into opposite camps, and we're going nowhere. We have to try and close that circle.
Just to wrap it up then, Professor Southall, on the issue of white privilege, was there acknowledgement of that?
Sorry, I missed that. There was an interruption.
So I was asking on the issue of white privilege from those that participated in these surveys, in these focus groups rather, was there an acknowledgement of the existence of white privilege?
Yes, there was quite a lot of recognition of this. And there was quite a lot of understanding that the recognition came from the past, that it was generational, and that it comes from privileged access to schooling and so on. So I think that is something to recognize and welcome. At the same time, of course, there was reluctance to forego the advantages of good schooling and of living in pleasant houses when most of the population does not have such an advantage. And there was a sense that the improvement has to come from outside the white sphere. I think there is a recognition that apartheid geography buttresses white privilege, and a recognition that this has to change.
Thank you for your time, and of course that book is going to be available in stores, Whites and Democracy in South Africa.